I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we offer the most comprehensive version yet of the peace plan taking shape behind closed doors, as the Europeans ask Trump to deploy a private army of military firms to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire. Plus, we report on the significance of the meeting between the leaders of China, Russia and India, and reflect on the gravest strategic miscalculations made by both sides in the war so far.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 1st of September, 3 years and 191 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. But first, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Let's try and take this in some sort of chronological order. Let's go back over the weekend. Russia launched another large-scale drone and missile strike against Ukraine overnight, Friday, Saturday. That's the third combined strike with over 500 drones and missiles since the Alaska summit. Friday, Saturday saw 8 Iskander-M or KN-23 variant ballistic missiles fired from Rostov Oblast and Krasnodar Krai. 6 of those were brought down. 37 KH-101 caliber Iskander-K and KH-59 cruise missiles fired from Saratov Oblast from the Black Sea and also occupied Zaporizhia Oblast. Most of those, 32 of the 37 brought down. And 537 Shahed-type drones from basically all around Ukraine, 537 of which 510 were shot down. 5 missiles and 24 drones got through, struck 7 locations. President Zelensky said primarily civilian infrastructure had been hit in the attacks across the country, causing deaths and injuries. He said 1 residential building had been hit in Zaporizhia city, killing civilians there, injuring dozens. The Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, their assessment is it continues to be that Russia used the lead up to the Alaska summit to stockpile drones and missiles, conducting more limited strikes against Ukraine in the build-up there to falsely present itself, in their words, as a good faith negotiator to the US administration. They say Russia will likely escalate its strikes against Ukraine in the coming weeks to leverage its replenished missile and drone stockpiles and degrade Ukrainian energy infrastructure ahead of winter. Now, they may be pulsing the attacks, Russia, so getting lots of missiles for a couple of nights and then not an awful lot, because yesterday there are only 86 drones fired by Russia at Ukraine. Yesterday, 10 got through air defence, 4 people were killed in Kharkiv, Donetsk and Kherson Oblast. Now, that continued air campaign contrasts, as is the way of these things in recent weeks, with other strikes also overnight Friday, Saturday, but this time against oil infrastructure inside Russia. Ukraine's General Staff said on Saturday that various combat elements in the Ukrainian armed forces, including from the Unmanned Systems Forces and Special Ops Forces, conducted drone strikes against the Syazan oil refinery in Samara Oblast and the Krasnodar oil refinery in Krasnodar Krai. Now, also on Saturday, Ukrainian broadcaster Suspilna said that a source in the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence department, told them that they had destroyed a Russian explosives warehouse in Tula Oblast. That's to the south of Moscow, halfway-ish, not quite halfway, but a bit closer to Moscow, but halfway-ish between Kharkiv and Moscow. They say the Alekinsky chemical plant was attacked and say this produces pyroxylin powder for small arms ammunition, artillery systems and rocket engines. There was a lot of coverage on social media of a very large fire there. Still on Saturday, an unknown assailant shot and killed the former Ukrainian parliamentary chairperson Andrei Pabryi in Lviv city. More on this I know from Francis shortly, so I won't say any more on that. Still Saturday, and Russian forces conducted a drone strike against the port of Chornomorsk in Odessa, just south of Odessa port itself. Air raid sirens across Odessa Oblast were activated late Saturday night into the early hours of Sunday. The attack there reportedly consisted of 50 Shahed 136 type drones, which approached from the Black Sea. Unconfirmed reports suggested that a Sao Tome and Principe flagged cargo vessel was damaged during the attack. That report comes from Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm. We're still on Saturday and into Crimea. 2 Russian helicopters, an Mi-8 and Mi-24. So the Mi-8, the old HIP, and Mi-24, the Hind, basically a gunship, said to be destroyed at Simferopol airport in Crimea, just south of the centre of the peninsula there. Local residents reported seeing smoke rising from the airport area, and there are a number of images on social media that you'll be able to find. Russian authorities confirmed Crimea had come under drone attack, but said 18 Ukrainian drones were shot down on Saturday morning, gave no further details. However, staying in Crimea, and at some point over the weekend, I think Saturday, but I've not been able to verify this, there was a Ukrainian missile strike on the west side of the peninsula. A new satellite imagery confirms Ukraine's strike on a Russian border post near Voloshin. That's Wesko-Amiarsk, right at the top of the peninsula on the western side, where it meets basically Kherson Oblast. This comes from the Crimean Wind Monitoring Group. They say a barracks was completely destroyed, 1 serviceman killed, several wounded. They also say 6 Kivas-class hovercraft were destroyed. And then on to Sunday, major fire broke out at a chemical plant in Balashivka. That's just to the east of Moscow city centre. The blaze spread to nearby buildings, sending thick smoke over the city. It was very dramatic imagery you'll be able to see. No further details on what caused it or any particular strikes in the area. Now then, also over the weekend, someone in the Kremlin's clearly decided that statistics are the latest weapon to bash us all with. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov gave a major speech at the Russian MOD Collegium on Friday, in which, amongst other things, he wildly exaggerated, I think, Russian gains in recent weeks. He said that between 300 and 400 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory per month had been taken at the start of 2025, and that has now increased to between 600 to 700 square kilometres per month. Those figures are disputed by every other sensible analyst that I look at, including ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, Deep State, and soldiers and others in theatre that I speak to. So just to clear this up, the amount of square kilometres of Ukrainian territory seized by Russia from January to August this year is assessed by the ISW as being the following numbers. So starting from January, 430 square kilometres, then 310, 190, 170, 500, 460, 450, and 500 square kilometres in August of this year. So I'm not meaning to downplay it at all, but it's certainly not the figures that Belousov gave. He also said that Russia has shifted its priorities to producing light vehicles instead of heavy armoured vehicles. That's probably reflecting, I would imagine, the time, possibly the cost as well, but mainly the time to produce heavy stuff like tanks and artillery systems. He said Russia had delivered nearly 23,000 motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles and buggies to the front lines, starting from around about a year ago, and said they plan to put an additional 12,000 such vehicles in the field by the end of summer, basically. Then, continuing the statistics theme, on Saturday, Russian Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, he said that Russia had seized 3,500 square kilometres of territory and 149 settlements since March 2025. He offered a load of other stats about land being seized, but then, interestingly, he said that Russian forces currently occupy 99.7% of Luhansk Oblast, 79% of Donetsk Oblast, 76% in Kherson Oblast, and 74% of Zaporizhia Oblast. Now, those figures, I think, do broadly match the assessment of various people that I trust. I think that's quite interesting that he's come out with something not wildly out of the ballpark, but also that does show up Putin's ridiculous demand that the entirety of those 4 oblasts be handed over in any kind of peace settlement. I wonder if it was a bit of a gaffe by Valery there, highlighting that apart from Luhansk Oblast, the others are around about 3/4 held by Russia, not quite as Putin would have it. Anyway, his maths didn't go down well in Russia. Various Russian mill bloggers heavily criticised his comments, and they called his figures a very big exaggeration, and asked which elements of the Russian military command structure were feeding false reports to the Russian high command. Quite out. We do see these sort of hernias occasionally from the Russian mill blog community. I think a lot of it is just allowed, maybe even controlled. Anyway, all these statistics clearly aimed at shaping the narrative of this indomitable, incorrigible Russian advance. But what they do, of course, is they belie the cost. Russian opposition outlets Meduza and Mediazona say data from the Russian Register of Inheritance cases suggests that at least 93,000 Russian military personnel died in 2024. That's almost twice as many as the year before, about 50,000 in 2023. Now, the outlets caveated that the data are imperfect for assessing Russian losses, as relatives of deceased in Russia have at least 180 days to open an inheritance case for dead or presumed dead Russian soldiers. So they say that the data could be about 6 months out of date. They do say, though, that there was only an increase of cases involving missing persons in the data since 2024 among men, not women, a phenomenon they say can only be consistent with an increase in fatality rates in the war. On the ground over the weekend, very little movement on the ground. Again, continuing the theme of recent weeks, there are reports of a Ukrainian counterattack in the north, near Kupiansk. They say there's a report that the village of Mirne has been reclaimed north of Kupiansk. That's in Kharkiv region, which would slightly reduce the pressure there, although Kupiansk is still under extreme pressure. Otherwise, no move in the Donbass, no move in that lodgement, the Dobropia lodgement. It's not expanding. Ukraine continues to counterattack there, but they've still not wiped it out completely. And then just finally, Francis, a little bit sort of left of field, but worth noting, yesterday, Sunday, it was announced a big defence procurement to sale. Norway is going to buy 5 British-built Type 26 anti-submarine warfare frigates in a £10 billion deal. Now, this is significant. So the Type 26, the designs of which have also been bought by Canada. So Britain is building 8 of these Type 26s. 2 are currently going through trials. The rest are in build. It's thought that the third one, which has provisionally been titled HMS Belfast, that might have to slip. So that might have to go to Norway so they can get the first one in the sort of early 2030s. We're calling it HMS Belfast. It's not actually official until it's commissioned. But this is a big deal. I mean, that Norway, with whom Britain is increasingly cooperating on the military front. We've got the Poseidon anti-submarine hunting aircraft working together out of Lossiemouth in Scotland. And now these anti-submarine frigates that are going to be very able to work together and integrate in a force package. That is quite a significant deal. It's a little bit wonkish on the defence industrial side, but it is worth keeping an eye on there, especially with a view to how the industry is coming into play in the war in Ukraine, as we see defence procurement being more and more important. Now that's up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Another day, another deadline, the 6th, I think, set to be missed without consequence. 2 weeks ago, in Washington, Donald Trump said that by this date, Putin and Zelensky should be meeting with each other before a trilateral meeting between the 3 leaders could take place. Yet there's no sign of President Trump, let alone any hint from him that there will be consequences for this or the latest deadly Russian strikes. In fact, the latest mood music from the White House is that it believes it's Europe undermining Trump's quest for peace. As Axios report, senior White House officials are said to be losing patience with some leaders on the continent, who they claim are privately pushing the Ukrainian president to hold out for an unrealistic peace deal and want the US to bear the full cost of the war, while they refuse to contribute. Getting to a deal is an art of the possible, an official told Axios. But some of the Europeans continue to operate in a fairy tale land that ignores the fact it takes 2 to tango. Apparently, while the British and French are more constructive, it's other countries within the coalition of the willing who the Americans believe are obstructing a deal. It follows the most comprehensive version yet of how a European-led mission could enforce any peace deal. It's been reported by the Telegraph's Joe Barnes and Connor Stringer, looking in great detail at the peace plan currently taking shape behind closed doors. And the newest part of it is that Trump is in talks with the European allies about potentially allowing armed American contractors to help build fortifications to protect interests in the country as part of a workaround after he promised US troops would not be stationed in Ukraine. The hope is, and I think we have to emphasise that word here, these contractors could be deployed to help rebuild frontline defences, new bases and protect US businesses, as well as acting as a deterrent to discourage Putin from breaking an eventual ceasefire. Now that plan, which has of course been mooted before, we've discussed it, but this is the first time we've seen it as a fixed proposal put forward by Europe, is one that comes alongside a range of other so-called security guarantees drawn up by the coalition of the willing. It includes air policing, training and Black Sea naval missions. So let's go through them. To quote Joe and Connor, European officials said the primary strategy for preventing war was continuing to rebuild Ukraine's battle-stricken armed forces into the main form of deterrence. Under the plan, Ukrainian formations would defend a reinforced border at the front lines as agreed in a peace deal. Kyiv's forces would be rearmed and trained by European NATO allies using existing and new mechanisms. Ukraine could continue to buy US systems such as Patriot air defense batteries or HIMARS rocket launchers using funds provided by European allies. Frontline fortifications and bases nearby could be built by American private military contractors, as was done in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some European nations have floated the idea of a demilitarized buffer zone to separate Ukrainian and Russian forces once the fighting has ended. It could be patrolled by peacekeepers or observers as agreed by both Kyiv and Moscow in any settlement. The Kremlin has suggested China could be used as a security guarantor in talks over a peace deal. Trump also suggested deploying Chinese troops during his meeting with European leaders, according to the Financial Times. Now, the idea that China could be considered neutral in this war is, as we all know, an absurdity, and more on that later. Anyway, they go on. A European-led force could then be stationed deeper in Ukraine to offer a third line of defence. It would primarily serve as another deterrence deployment made up of around 30,000 European troops. Dozens of countries have told their counterparts they would be willing to join that deployment. These include Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, as well as the Baltic, Nordic and Scandinavian nations. There would also be military trainers moved to new bases in western Ukraine. The Europeans have also been in discussions over introducing a no-fly zone to allow Ukraine to confidently reopen commercial aviation routes. The scheme could be phased, starting in the west and slowly covering more airspace until the entire country is safe enough for commercial travel. At first, the mission, using Western fighter jet patrols and ground-based air defence systems, would aim to open Lviv and other Ukrainian airports in the west. As confidence builds in any ceasefire arrangements holding, the mission would be extended eastwards. Now, as you'll know, listening at home, allowing air travel to start is seen as a really key element in providing an investment boost to the country, as well as allowing refugees to return home. And what of the naval strand? Under the plans, Turkey would lead a naval mission in the Black Sea aimed at securing commercial shipping routes in and out of Ukraine. Bulgaria and Romania would lead efforts to demine the waters. So that is the scope of the plans currently being discussed as far as we understand. For more details, including maps and diagrams, do read that piece and we'll link to it in the show notes. One of the other key things that comes out of it is the degree to which the Europeans believe US logistical support is a prerequisite, especially requests for assistance in the form of American heavy lift aircraft to move equipment and troops eastwards towards Ukraine. They also need them, apparently, to be able to purchase weaponry. Ukraine has already tabled that proposal we've discussed, which would see the country promise to buy a further $90 billion worth of hardware once the war concludes. But another prerequisite for any European deployment would be an offer of American intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance support, officials said. Incredibly, European nations lack the satellite capabilities needed to sufficiently monitor any ceasefire in Ukraine and on the continent. So an important piece, especially given the quite remarkable footage of Putin arriving to yet another red carpet, this time in China, for a summit of a coalition dubbed the Axis of Upheaval, a gathering hosted by President Xi of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, one we've talked about before. The Kremlin said the two leaders held detailed discussions, including a debrief on the summit with Trump, and it's the beginning of an unprecedented 4-day overseas visit for Putin. He'll be the main guest at a military parade in Tiananmen Square to mark the 80th anniversary of World War II. Perhaps most significant, though, is the attendance of Prime Minister Modi. He skipped last year's summit, but the Indian Prime Minister believed to be there now because of the fact that he no longer has to risk the reputational damage of attending alongside Putin, now that Trump has shaken hands with him. Plus, of course, the political context of the secondary tariffs which were imposed on India by the White House, ostensibly because of their purchasing of Russian energy and thereby bankrolling Russia's war effort, but really, we believe, because of diplomatic tensions between the two countries on other matters. The New York Times reported that Trump demanded Modi nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize after the flare-up with Pakistan, which Modi refused, irritating Trump. Clearly, the opportunity afforded to China to move India, the world's largest democracy, more closely into its orbit is too good an opportunity to miss. At the summit, Xi said the two countries represented 3 billion people and the world is quickly changing. It's time for the dragon and the elephant to come together, he said. Now, it seems US diplomats are trying to rectify this. Their embassy in India posted earlier today that the partnership between the US and India continues to reach new heights, a defining relationship of the 21st century. From innovation and entrepreneurship to defence and bilateral ties, it's the enduring friendship between our two peoples that fuels this journey. So we will continue to monitor the outcomes of the summit and update you with any other developments this week. But to end in the diplomatic realm, it would be remiss not to end on that story Dom referenced earlier from Ukraine, when the prominent politician Andrei Parubi was gunned down in broad daylight in Lviv. Police said the 54-year-old was shot by a hail of bullets at around noon local time and died at the scene. The gunman was on an electric bike and appeared to be dressed as a delivery driver with his face covered by a helmet, according to media reports. Vowing to find the killer, President Zelensky said all necessary forces and means are engaged in the investigation. Unfortunately, the crime was carefully planned. Some Ukrainian officials have hinted at Russian involvement, and it's not surprising. Parubi was very well known. He was a speaker in the country from 2016 until 2019, a leading figure in Ukraine's pro-European protest movements of 2004-2014. During the widespread protests against Yanukovych, president of the time, of course, he refused to be implicated in the actions of the government, and he led the self-defense volunteer units protecting the demonstrators from government troops. After the ousting of Yanukovych later in 2014, he was appointed Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, holding that role during Moscow's occupation of Crimea and its backing of separatists who seized parts of the Donbass. That made him a prime target of Russian threats and intimidation. He reportedly survived an assassination by a grenade that year. Ukraine's Prime Minister has called for a prompt investigation, said that this was a profound loss for the country. Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's Foreign Minister, of course, described Parubi as a patriot and a statesman who made an enormous contribution to the defence of Ukraine's freedom, independence and sovereignty. He was a man who has rightfully earned his place in the history books. It follows, of course, a series of notable assassinations of Ukrainians in the past 12 months. A former Ukrainian lawyer and politician shot dead in the suburb of Madrid by an assassin a few weeks back. In July, the Ukrainian intelligence officer shot dead as he walked through Kyiv by a masked assailant, reportedly linked to Russia's security service. Some are speculating that this murder and the one of the intelligence officer are in retaliation for the killings of high-ranking military figures on Russian soil. But we simply do not know. Nonetheless, it is a development, of course, we will continue to track. But let's turn to our guest now, friend of the podcast, Professor Phillips O'Brien. Phil, always a pleasure, and we're lucky to have you, as you've just published a new book called War and Power: Who Wins Wars and Why, and it opens with this dedication: to the people of Ukraine who have had to endure the worst depredations of war because of a basic inability of others to understand power. So let's start there. What, in your view, have the majority of today's analysts and leaders got wrong?
Thanks a lot, Francis. You might say they've gotten it wrong from the micro to the macro level. The macro misunderstanding is that Russia was somehow this great power that was going to steamroller Ukraine. If you put your mind back to 2022, the argument was whether Ukraine should even get any light weapons. Well, many analysts were saying, in fact, some of the most famous analysts were saying, don't even arm Ukraine. It doesn't make any difference. They're going to lose in a few days. And moreover, that they might not even mind losing and joining Russia. Simply misunderstanding Russian power, overestimating it grossly, and at the same time underestimating Ukrainian power, played a huge role in creating this war in the first place, which is why Ukraine just had these very light weapons to begin with, supplied from outside. And then from that point on, I would argue there's been constant mistakes and power estimation, overestimating Putin's nuclear threats, underestimating what the Ukrainians can learn. Oh, they could never learn to operate Patriots for a year or fly F-16s. To the point now, actually, where there's just regular mistakes, and what matters in this war. People get so excited about a farm field on the Donbass 3 weeks ago when the Russians did this infiltration. And people started talking about a Ukrainian collapse or a Russian operational maneuver breakthrough, which is nonsense after what we've seen and how defensive technology works. So just there's been a constant underestimation of what Ukraine can do and a constant overestimation of what Russia can do. And that has worked throughout this entire process to make this war what it is.
Well, thanks for that overview. And I'm really interested in hearing some of the other arguments that you make in the book. But I just wanted to follow up on something we were talking about in the updates earlier. And of course, it's this talk about what Europe could do after a peace settlement in Ukraine. And I was arguing last week that this is pretty counterproductive. It has to act before to change the calculus. Otherwise, you're just incentivizing the Russians to continue their pushes in the East and elsewhere. First of all, do you agree with that view? And do feel free to disagree with me if you do. And either way, what actions would you suggest that they do need to take at this moment, the Europeans, to change things?
I couldn't agree more. On that, Francis. That the whole problem is that this discussion of U.S. security guarantees, which the Europeans will then act on, is exactly the same as, what will Trump do with sanctions? The United States isn't going to give any security guarantees that matter. And so this entire discussion that we're having endlessly, will the U.S. do this? Will the U.S. do that? The U.S. will provide almost nothing. Certainly, the U.S. will provide nothing that would either have Russians capable of firing on U.S. forces or indeed U.S. forces firing on Russians. There was, they'll provide air support. That seems to have disappeared. They're going to provide this. They're going to fight that. Now we just hear intelligence and logistics. And intelligence and logistics can be shut off instantly. There's no permanence to that. There's no forces in Ukraine. It's the flimsiest of flimsy ideas. In fact, I would argue it's worse than Budapest. And so I just don't understand this discussion in Europe now about, we'll get the US on board and then we'll do something. It's far better for Europe to plan with the US out of the game. That's the only rational way for European states to address the future. They look honestly at this and say the U.S. is basically out. We saw the reality at Anchorage. Trump wants to cooperate with Putin. He's never going to put sanctions on Russia. He's not going to give you meaningful security guarantees. He might sell a few more weapons, and that makes the U.S. some money. But actually, at the same time, they're trying to restrain the Ukrainians from doing range fire. So they give with one hand and take away with the other. So that Europe should almost cleanse itself of this American obsession and say, what can we do to help Ukraine win the war, or at least come out of the war in the best possible shape, and then deter Russia? based on our own resources. And Europe has enough to do this. They have almost 600 million people, 20% of the world economy. They can do this, and they should do it on their own without the USA.
Well, thanks very much, Phil, for that. I'm glad that we're in agreement. But of course, it does mark, if that is true, a major deviation from the current strategy being adopted by Europe. I mean, do you think this is premised on a totally flawed understanding of where we are? Or do you think that they are just trying to buy time, Phil, because the more far-sighted individuals do see that they need to, it's going to be Europe's fight, as it were, but they just are trying to avert the worst case scenarios of a complete American withdrawal? I'm interested in your take on that. And then over to Dom, who I know has got a lot of questions as well.
Well, it depends whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, Francis. The optimistic view is that Europeans, certain European leaders, understand the U.S. is probably out of the game and are playing for time. They don't take the security guarantees seriously. They think the war will go on. And what they're trying to do is not cause a rupture with the U.S. Very interesting, by the way. I don't know if you saw Friedrich Merz's very recent tweet where he basically said, I'm preparing for a long war. So that's sort of that one view. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view, by the way, I've become more of a pessimist than I ever was, is that this is a generation that's failed, and they can't admit they failed. And so they're pretending that somehow the old US is going to come back as long as they flatter Trump, as long as they're good boys and good little school children. Eventually, they'll try and get something out of the US and keep it going. And by the way, probably there are elements of truth in both views. I think we are looking for certain people who are terrified of the future and unwilling to face it realistically. That might be, sadly, a question or an issue that's stronger in Britain than other places. I know the British are desperate to hold on to the special relationship. But then there are others, particularly the Baltics and the Nordics, who I think have a very realistic view of where things are. So it is this tension, and I don't know which way it's going to go.
Phil, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. If I could sort of dial in a little bit onto the military side. There are, as I said, two air campaigns right now. You've got Russia trying to break Ukraine's morale and the will to resist through the targeting of civilian areas. And at the same time, you've got Ukraine using air to attack Russia's oil infrastructure with increasingly long-range attacks. Which, in your view, has historically shown to be more successful, going for morale and the people, or actually attacking the economy? And which is more sustainable?
Well, that's two good questions. I mean, if you look at the Second World War, that has very clear delineation between the two because both campaigns were tried and one worked much better than the other. In the Second World War, campaigns against morale, either the Germans' bombing of the British during the Blitz or the bombing of German cities during the combined bombing operation to sort of break German morale, those generally failed. Some would even argue they were counterproductive, that they made states and populations more united. Then, on the other hand, I have a strong belief that the attacks on German railway networks and German fuel were devastating in the war effort for Germany, that basically they ground the German economy down. And I would say then of the two that we're looking now, that it is very much the Ukrainian strategy, if they're doing it. Now, we assume they're doing it, and we assume we're doing it because we've seen their target list in August. And if you look at the Ukrainian target list in August, you'll see that there's a lot of Russian fuel oil refineries on that list. Now, if they can keep that up, now they've supposedly destroyed about 20% of Russian refining capacity, maybe a little bit less. There was 17%, I think, the assumption by the beginning of the last week in August, so it might be closer to 20% now, because they had a number of refinery attacks in the last few days. If they could keep that up, reach more refineries deeper in Russia and actually destroy them, that would hold out a great deal of promise. What we don't know is if they can maintain that campaign.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to, with some trepidation, ask a question about strategy, a word I know, well, I use advisedly, knowing that your disdain for its casual use. So with somewhat holding my hat in my hands here, talking about strategy. From Russia's point of view, they've got the air campaign, as we've just described, going after civilians. They've got the grinding but acceptable advances on the ground and almost no naval activity because they've been largely pushed out of the Black Sea. Ukraine, as we say, the air campaign, as we've just been discussing, they've got, I would suggest, perhaps a generous interpretation would be a managed resistance at the front, counterattacking where they're able to. And you could say they've had a victory in the Black Sea. But just in terms of the strategy, firstly, do you agree with those two sort of models? Which do you think shows greater coherence in terms of ends, ways and means, that golden thread that runs through strategy?
Oh God, I don't necessarily believe in ends, ways, and means, but the word that bugs me is strategic, and I think that I lost it about a year and a half ago when someone described, was it the village of Toretsk as the strategic village of Toretsk. Strategic means something much greater than important or interesting or village of the moment. For something to be strategic, it has to have such an impact that it will change an important element in the war, i.e., it changes the strategy if something falls or not falls. The Russian strategy seems to be based on the notion that if they take something, they can hold it forever, and that therefore they can suffer massive losses by doing these assaults to take farm fields and never, ever have to give it up. Now, that is, in my mind, a very odd strategy unless you believe the U.S. is on your side. That if you believe the U.S. will enforce a deal where you get to keep everything you've taken, then maybe that is a reasonable strategy. So it's a gamble a bit on the U.S. On the other hand, the losses being suffered by the Russians are not sustainable in a long-run war if Ukraine is going to be armed by its partners and supported in the way that it should. The Ukrainian strategy, on the other hand, I think now you could say they took too many losses up until this year. They seem to be better at restraining their losses a bit now. But I do actually think the Ukrainian strategy on going air-sea is the right one, because that's one thing where the Russians have shown actually a great deal of weakness, is things like air defense and sea defense. And if you can start hammering them in these strategic industries, and oil is a strategic industry, rail is a strategic industry, then that is the best way to damage the Russian war effort. And if the Russians start having oil problems, that's a real issue, because they will have losses in the money they make from overseas, very serious losses. It'll make it much more difficult to actually power the country, heat the country, and it will affect the Russian war effort. So it maybe took the Ukrainians a while to get there, but I think they're on to a better strategy now than they were. It's a question, of course, whether they can pull it out, and whether, of course, the Russians are right in gambling the U.S. is going to back them in letting them keep everything they've seized and try to pressure the Ukrainians to give them more.
Now, just on that US support or US attitude, as you say, Donald Trump has been successful in forcing NATO to adopt this 5% spending pledge, no matter how you cut the cake, up at 5%. Now, in any objective analysis, the greatest threat to NATO has got to be Russia right now. But Trump's actions with Putin, literally shaking hands all the rest of it, is at odds with a worldview that sees Russia as the greatest security threat to the alliance. However, Donald Trump has said, as we know, that he's going to allow NATO to buy weapons for Ukraine. So all this is all over the place.
We still don't know how much they've allowed them to buy or what, or how long they'll be delivered there. Trump is great at playing on pro-Ukraine supporters' hopes. He's just brilliant at it. I think people underestimate Trump because they say, oh, he's a buffoon, or he's a blowhard, and he changes his mind every day. Actually, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, he's never changed his mind. He's had to pivot once or twice because of pro-Ukraine public opinion and pretend to be supportive of Ukraine. But he's actually been amazingly consistent. The way he's fended off sanctions is really quite remarkably consistent. He's never put a sanction on Putin, but he's always bluffed his way to act like he would. Now, when it comes to the weapons, we say, he's selling weapons to Ukraine. Well, we know of a few Patriot batteries. By the way, most of them were actually allocated ahead of time, or the ones that are recent. We don't know when they're going to get there. We don't know what else, actually, in numbers. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about hundreds of millions, which is nothing in this war. So I do think we just have to be careful from saying, the Trump will allow Europeans to buy things for Ukraine and send them. In fact, what he's done is kept the Europeans from sending storm shadows and scalps that Ukraine can then fire into Russia. So I just, on the whole, think we need to be very careful of this language. He's not been very helpful for Ukraine. He's mostly damaged Ukraine, and he's been very helpful to Putin.
That sort of spikes my guns, actually, because I was then going to ask if the whole 5% thing was just some great Ponzi confidence scheme to get European and Canadian taxpayers' money into US arms companies, because maybe I'm going a little bit too far down the...
It's interesting because it's not 5%, it's 3.5%.
Yeah, and 1.5% on bridges and leaflets and God knows what else. Yeah, you're right.
Sounds like fixing potholes.
Yeah.
That other 1.5%. So it's 3.5%. Now, mostly that's come about actually because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I would argue. But Trump sort of got Europeans to pledge that formally, and that's not a bad thing. But Europeans will probably have to spend more than that going forward. Where it's slightly backfired, you might say, is the Type 26 order example, that the Norwegians were considering buying an American platform, and then actually they pivoted towards a European platform, choosing the British one. Partly, it was said, because they're worried about buying U.S. weapons and therefore not having control over them. So this is one of the test cases, I think, of European seriousness. If the Europeans just use this money to buy a lot more F-35s, that'll be a disaster. That was one of the things people, we'll buy F-35s and keep the U.S. happy. If the Europeans actually get to the point where they spend this money, they would be far better to spend it on European-made systems and take control of their own security future.
It's almost as if you're reading my notes, because I was going to make that point about the Type 26. I presume Donald Trump is a little bit grumpy today that the US shipyards didn't get the order, but he must be delighted that Europe is stepping up to take care of its own strategic, in a small area. Anyway, yes, we will see. We will see. A couple more for me, if I may. Now, Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belosov, I mentioned earlier on in the updates, he said, as well as at this talk, he said 97% of wounded Russian soldiers are returned to the front lines. Now, I noticed that August had the lowest casualty rate amongst a Russian, and in terms of killed, wounded, prisoner or missing, for 16 months. What is your account for this relatively low monthly Russian casualty rate in the last few months? And do you think it is, as Belosov says, just the wounded returning to the fight?
Well, by the way, in the last 2 weeks, they've hardly taken anything. So there were some advances earlier in the month. And there were those units that were actually the infiltrated units that were, from what we can tell, cut off. So we don't know what the losses are from there. So I'm just a little reluctant, judging a war that something that happened 2 or 3 days ago and losses. The Russian losses are still and Ukrainian ones too, I'm sure, are still quite high by any historic standard on what is going on in the war. But one thing that we've heard, and I think that's true, that talk about motorcycles and vehicles, is that the losses have been so high. There's very few vehicles left, by the way. Really heavy vehicles. We don't know how many tanks are actually left that the Russians can deploy in a reasonable way. It might be that all we can do now and all they can do are these very light rushes of troops on motorcycles and buggies to take a little bit of land. And that is what the war has become. It certainly seems to be that that's what it's become in the land war. And that therefore that's going to keep casualties to a certain slightly lower level. But I'm just a little reluctant to say, casualties are much lower now than they were until we actually see what happens and see everything reported. I mean, the Ukrainians have them down a bit, but they're still, I think, in the Ukrainian way, not averaging 1,200 a day, but 900 or so a day.
Yeah, that is a fair point. Yes, we'll keep an eye on that. Don't get too sucked into the stats, which I think is what they'll want us to do. Just last one for me then, and just finishing on the impact of any withdrawal of US support. How much targeting information is reliant upon the US? And do you think these new Flamingo cruise missiles that Ukraine is supposed to be fielding, are they going to be able to operate without US support? And just on that, should our reaction to the inevitable Russian nuclear saber rattling over this potential targeting autonomy Ukraine might now be able to enjoy, should that be any different to the past threats?
Yeah, I'm sure Russia will go nuclear this time. Well, when it comes to targeting in Russia, I don't think the U.S. is providing any help at this now. I mean, I don't know. They haven't told me. But they've not letting the Ukrainians fire U.S. systems or even partly U.S.-made systems into Russia. So I cannot believe the U.S. is to help them in that way. So I would be a little reluctant. I've heard of stories, hints from Ukrainians that I know and trust that actually intelligence cooperation now isn't nearly what it was. And partly, the U.S. itself isn't concentrating on Ukraine. So it's not actually gathering a lot of information on Russia. In fact, it's gutted its gutted a lot of its Russian intelligence collection. So, there might be some targeting help on targets in occupied Ukraine, but at this point, the Ukrainians have a pretty good idea, I think, of what they're looking for and what they're trying to do. And they'll probably fire the flamingos. And by the way, I don't know if you guys heard, there was a report that they fired a flamingo a few days ago. I don't know if that's been confirmed or not, because I've not seen good enough evidence. It'd be interesting to see what you guys think on that.
I saw a report saying that it had been fired, but it looked very staged. It was a very clear image. So it may well have been fired, but I don't know if it had been fired operationally. Although I suppose they're firing a long way behind the lines. I'm not sure.
I saw, one of these great internet sources where someone said that I think one of the attacks on Crimea might have been a flamingo, but I've not seen any evidence that I would call convincing on that. So it'd be interesting to see if you guys had found that out. When it comes to the oil refineries, in some ways, they don't need U.S. intelligence on that. We can't hide a refinery. They're not small. Yeah, and you can't build them quickly either. So the Russian refining system is something the Ukrainians should have a pretty good idea about at this point, and already seem to have a pretty good idea about it because they're going after the refineries where they can. It would be useful to get U.S. help if they go to a rail campaign and things like that. But I don't think, again, the Ukrainians, I don't think, can really count on having the U.S. backing them now. And so they're going to have to get by. I mean, war has a way of getting by and making do. And people say, oh, I can never get by without this. Well, sometimes you have to get by without that. And the Ukrainians are going to have to do that.
Phil, before we go to our final thoughts, I just want to bring things back to your new book. And I was reading it earlier on before we came on air. And one of the things that's quite striking about it is it ends by reflecting on how the lessons from Ukraine could potentially have ramifications for avoiding a potential conflict between the US and China. I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that. What lessons do you take away from this? And what must we learn to avoid an even graver crisis in the years ahead?
Well, if there's so many mistakes and assumptions about war that were made in 2021, 2022, and as I said in the book, these are mistakes that were also made, say, in 1914 or in early 1960s by the US and Vietnam. The primary mistake is that a war will go according to plan and be over relatively soon. The famous "we'll be home by Christmas" idea, which amazingly no one's ever home by Christmas, and yet people always still come up with this short war idea every time. And the short war idea is incredibly seductive while being constantly wrong, because no one goes into it going, aha, I'm going to get involved in a bloody quagmire there that's going to take years and kill millions of people. They go, I'm going to do this amazing military operation. It'll be over in a few days and I'll have a parade. And that second way of thinking, the short war, I'll have a win in a parade view, makes war far more likely. I mean, if Putin thought he was going to do that, and by the way, Trump thought he was going to do that when he launched the attack, and most European states thought that that was going to happen. And that made a war far more likely. I mean, if Putin and the Russians knew what they were going to get into, I don't think they would have quite started it the way that they did. So when we look at a war, I think you generally have to look at that a war is something that's going to metastasize and become far more horrible than you think. Now, this problem seems to be at least a bit more corrected than it was before 2022 when it comes to a US-China war. I hated the short war idea of US and China over Taiwan. There really was this idea, okay, the Chinese will try to take Taiwan. They either will or they won't in an amphibious operation. If they do, well, the war's over. If they don't, well, then they failed and the war will have to be ended, and we'll know how the war goes in 3 months or even a matter of weeks. What would most likely happen if the US and China go to war over something like Taiwan, of course, is it becomes a horror show and could go on for a long time. And I think on both sides, there are huge risks that will need to be run, and it's far better to make those risks known. I think the US is actually in a very bad shape for a long war and the way that it behaves, or at least its policies. So I think that's the sort of one of the big points I'm trying to get at. Never assume a war will go according to plan, like your war games have it, because they never do. And those war games, I think, are by themselves inherently deceptive.
Today is the first day of the school year in Ukraine, and in Kharkiv, the lucky ones, the lucky children, get to study underground. And that, of course, was what we saw when we visited there in November. The rest of the children have to study online even now. And I think it's very important that we spare a thought for them amid all of the other stories that are being covered at the moment. This war is still having massive ramifications for children, not only those, of course, who've been kidnapped from the occupied territories, which we draw attention to whenever we can, but just everyday life for children in Ukraine. So that's what I wanted to leave listeners with today. Dom, where would you like to leave listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I'll just point folk to some imagery you might be seeing on social media. It's about a Russian surveillance drone called a Gerbera or a Gerbera. I've heard it both ways. It's not a strike drone. We started seeing these things about a year ago, similar in shape, very slightly smaller than the Shed 136 or the Russian Geran equivalents, but thought to be much cheaper, so developed and rolled out in greater numbers. Anyway, the point is that there's one of these surveillance drones been shot down largely intact in Ukraine. And looking at the hard drive, it's still got the test footage from the Chinese factory from where it was delivered, which is a bit of a foobar by the Russian drone operators. And it kind of flies in the face, even though we knew it was happening. But this idea that China is providing diplomatic support, buying a bit of oil and supplying dual-use technology, this is another step closer to actually supplying military kit. It shows that they are. If this drone has still got footage on it from the Chinese factory it was delivered. But you will see this stuff on social media, and that's when I first looked at it, I couldn't really work out what I was looking at. That is it, and I think it's quite a telling intervention. I don't think there's any way anybody can suggest that China is not providing direct warfighting equipment for Russia.
Thanks, Dom. And I should say that, of course, Phil will link to your book in the show notes. But where would you like to leave listeners today?
Well, by the way, Dom, that was fascinating. I'd have to go look that up. I hadn't heard that, so I would like to see that. I think that's right about China. I don't know. Final thought. The final thought is something I've said earlier, which is, can Europeans, maybe not, just plan for their own future without relying on the United States? And when it comes to defending Ukraine and the Ukraine war and the future of European security, maybe the United States will go back to being it was, but maybe it never will. And it's up to Europeans now to take control of their own security destiny. And, that might not be a bad thing either. That relying on the United States has infantilized Europeans. And it would be better for countries across the continent to be much more serious about their security and stand up and take ownership of the problem.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.